Welcome back. This is the Prevention is the New Cure podcast. All things health and NHS with a political twist. I'm Steve Bryan. I'm the MP for Winchester. I'm currently the chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee in the House of Commons.
And I'm Helen Stokes-Lampard. I'm a frontline general practitioner in the Midlands. I'm chair of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges and chair of the National Academy for Social Prescribing. That's a few of my hats, but it's enough for now.
Thank you very much, Dame. Anyway, brilliant response to last week's pod. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all of your feedback. Keep it coming. Podcast at stevebryan.com. Find us on socials and suggest items that we might talk about in the pod surgery. Today, we are going to talk about primary care, and we got a diabetes special. But before that, now, as a dame, Helen, I presume you were in Westminster Cathedral on the weekend.
Do you know, Steve, I was devastated that my pretty invitation must have got lost in the post because I was at home watching the coronation like everybody else. But I'm glad you raised it because the coronation, whilst, I don't know about you, I mean, there wasn't an awful lot of conventional health prevention wrapped up into the whole coronation celebrations, but I was really pleased to see the environment featured in quite a big way. I don't know if you got to see the concert.
I loved the concert. I thought the concert was great. Other than Mark Owen from Take That needing a haircut, I thought they and boy, does he! When you just want to cut it. I thought they were fantastic. Take That hadn't been on stage since 2019, and I thought they were great. But no, the concert was great, and all the environmental stuff. I mean, do you know Prince Charles when he spoke about the environment and single-use plastics in particular in 1970? So it's like 4 years before I was born, and everyone said he was wacky and. Fair play to him. He used his position. Yes, he was born into power and privilege and all of that, but it's how you use it that counts, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, but one of my main mantras, which in fact I have shared with him when he was merely Prince Charles, was that what's good for the planet is almost invariably good for our health too. There are virtually nothing. There are only a tiny number of things that aren't good for both. And I think it's good for us to remember. So when we're talking about health prevention, it's really good to tie this stuff in with what's good for our planet as well. So, and concert was amazing. I just love a drone show. That's probably not good for the planet, but they are so uplifting and they do bring us all together.
I can't fly my son's drone in the park without sending it off into a tree or a fence. How they do that? I mean, it must all be completely
absolutely computer.
But so I wasn't invited either. But NFI, but I watched it on the television. Of course, it was raining outside in Hampshire, so it wasn't too bad. Sitting inside watching it with the kids.
Great view.
My 15-year-old daughter, who I like to, as reproduce quotes for the podcast, classic quote, because obviously it did go on a while. Why don't they just stick the crown on his head and be done with it?
My husband's quote, man gets new hat. Full stop.
Honestly, off to the tower. So I met our sovereign lord last week. He came to Westminster for a reception in Westminster Hall with MPs and members of the House of Lords, and he worked the room beautifully as he does. And the Queen came along a bit later on, so I met her as well. And there is a classic photo, Helen, that somebody took when I met him, second time I've met him, and we were just talking about his visit to Winchester, and I said I was the Winchester MP, and he said, "Oh yes, I was in Winchester last year." And I said, "Yep, you were unveiling the statue to Licoricia, who's a very famous Jewish resident of Winchester many years ago." And he said he really enjoyed it, and he's lovely. I really liked chatting with him. Anyway, Priti Patel was standing near me during this photo, and her face in the photo, it's a caption competition in the making. So if anybody finds this photo on my social media, on Facebook, Steve Bryan MP, you will see this photo, and your suggestions welcome, please. She's probably saying prevention is the new cure.
Oh, clearly.
Follow their pod.
But let's make the suggestions clean and repeatable, please. Just before we move on to the more pressing matters of the day, we had a street party where I live. And in fact, the street party moved onto our drive just to be safe and not to have to close the road. There wasn't much terribly healthy food there. A few things appeared, but what it did bring was a load of great community spirit, because there were people there who weren't terribly supportive of the royal family and some who were super supportive. But that's what didn't matter. There was a really good feeling about getting the community together. It sort of brings in, my interest and my love for social prescribing and how we do stuff better to make people feel good about themselves, make people feel worthwhile. boosting community spirit is such an amazing thing to do if you can possibly do it. So made new friends.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there wasn't great healthy food at ours. I mean, there was a hog roast, but look at I chatted to one resident who no longer lives in the village. He lives in a nursing home, and he's in his mid to late 80s. But what that day did for his mental health, just being back among his villagers that he'd grown up with, and so there was a mental health element to the day.
Brilliant.
Anyway, we're going to talk about
GP access.
It's been a big day, so we're recording this on Tuesday evening in Westminster. It's been a big day here. The government have today unveiled their primary care recovery plan, so making it easier for patients to contact their GP and end that 8 a.m. rush. New technology for general practitioners so that they upgrading their telephone systems so you don't get an engaged tone, making a promise that people won't have to ring back to the next day to get the appointment for the next day, and a big investment in community pharmacy to sort of spread the load and take the load off general practice. We had a statement in the House from the Secretary of State earlier, and I think it's been very well received by some general practitioners. I've done a bit of media on the subject, but Dr. Helen, general practitioner Helen, does it add up to some of its parts?
Well, look, if we, the first thing is this is just a plan about access to general practice, the transactional bit about getting in to see your GP or another healthcare professional. This is not a plan to fix the whole of general practice. And so long as you look at it through that lens about the transactional bits, it does an awful lot of great stuff. So nobody's going to argue that putting money into improving pharmacy services and expanding things there is good, empowering patients with a whole heap of new tools. People can use the NHS app better, improving GP telephony. All those things are really good. And I'm not hearing anyone being negative about that. There are some, a little bit of confusion about how much is new money, how much is repurposed old money, how much is taking money from other bits in the contract, but that'll all come out in the wash. And I think what we do need to be really honest about, I think the Royal College of GPs sort of said that this is not a silver bullet, or nobody's got a magic wand here. You're not going to suddenly magic up a load more GPs by doing a plan about improving access and simplifying and improving routes into general practice. And if we go back, Steve, to why this plan came about at all, it's because public satisfaction with access to general practice has plummeted. So public satisfaction with general practice has plummeted as an overall score, but when you unpick it, the dissatisfaction is with the access. Once you get through the door or down the phone line and actually speak to a GP or a nurse or one other healthcare professional, satisfaction remains incredibly high.
Yeah, so quality of care is good. It's just access.
Absolutely. So great stuff in here, but it's only part of the problem that's attempting to be solved yet, which is fine. But what I don't want is for people to think that they're going to phone their GP surgery tomorrow and things are miraculously going to be better.
I always say, look, I mean, I think we need to be positive. That's the spirit of Coronation Weekend, right? Glass half full. Primary care, as you know, I'm inherently a positive person, Helen. But primary care is, for me, it's a whole section of the healthcare landscape. Yeah. It's not just GPs.
Right.
If people expect, given the rising demand that there is, given the pressures on secondary care, especially emergency departments, for it to all come through GP land, then you'll never have enough GPs. You'll never be able to get through on the phone, no matter how good the telephone system. So you've got to spread the load, and that's why the community pharmacy access is important. And we can talk about what it is that they're proposing with that. And B, what are we going to say? You got to prevent ill health in the first place.
Absolutely.
And that reduces GP appointments.
Too right. Can we just pick up on the pharmacy side of this, Steve?
Yeah.
Because I think there's some really interesting stuff come out here. I mean, last weekend, we saw headlines that our community pharmacy services are under huge pressure. They're struggling to have enough staff. Certainly, we know that some staff have moved from being in community pharmacies into general practices, which has had a bizarre impact on some community pharmacies, and some are finding it financially difficult to cope and some have closed. But there's some really quite exciting developments coming in the whole world of community pharmacy. It was one of the bits of feedback we had since the last podcast. Somebody called Cyrus Hodivala got in touch with me, and he was extolling the virtues of robotics in community pharmacy. Now, we've had robots in hospital pharmacies for quite some time, picking the medicines, packing the medicines, but the rapid expansion that's happening in community pharmacies, obviously there's a big upfront expense, but if you've got a robot which can work 24/7, unlike a human, to pick the medicines and accurately pack the medicines, and they can also do things like making up those packs with the sort of daily bundles of medicines for every patient, that could be one of the solutions. So there's quite a lot of exciting tech in this space as well that could be helping.
And as you know, I used to be the pharmacy minister. I used to bang on about pharmacy is part of primary care, pre-primary care, but it's primary care. But I think, am I right? Is it fair, Helen, to say that in GP land there may have been traditionally a little bit of reticence that pharmacists are not on a par with the clinicians in the GP surgery down the road, but there's been a recognition that they are highly trained clinicians, and actually GPs can't do it all, don't need to do it all, and if they're going to focus on the patients that really need to see them, they need to bring in that wider family, and that attitude has changed now. Do you think that's fair?
Look, I'm so young, Steve, I can't possibly comment about what the distant past was. But I think you're right about attitudes changing right across the board about a range of healthcare professionals that work with GPs and their teams. And pharmacists certainly fall into that category. We've employed several pharmacists within our own practice, and they are just amazing, dynamic, valuable members of the team. And we've got a great relationship with our community pharmacists. So I think they're absolutely part of the solution. Nowadays, any new pharmacist qualifying, I think it is as of 2025, will also be able to prescribe medicines and not just dispense them. And there are a large number of pharmacists who have upskilled in that regard over the last few years. So there's upskilling going on as well.
Yeah, so that's where we should probably end this bit. Is that's the difference here. So I think there's about £645 million over 2 years to expand community pharmacy services. And I went to a pharmacist last summer with earache. If you've got an outer ear infection, they'll give you something over the counter, OTC. Yep. If you've got an inner ear infection, they can't. So they can now do much more prescribing based on the Pharmacy First pilots, which I started when I was in office actually back in 2018. So they're rolling that out across England. They're funding it. So with ear infections, sore throat, UTIs, widening that access to contraceptive oral contraception pills, and that is a good innovation. But of course, what that needs is the investment, because pharmacists can't just do it on goodwill. They've done that for too long, and they're going to close, and they are closing. So my question in the House today was, how quickly can we get this investment out there? And the other thing is, I'm just interested in your view on this, finally. If you have read access to the patient record in a pharmacy, which you do at the moment, you don't have write access, do you?
Correct.
And write-in access is important, right? Because you need to know that your patient's been given a prescription somewhere else.
Absolutely essential. It has to be two-way. You've got to write as well as read. Also, with this great expansion of more pharmacists being encouraged to help with the diagnosis and management of hypertension, actually, patients who are on antihypertensive medication do need to have blood test monitoring. So they need to have their kidney function monitored regularly. And actually, that's not something that pharmacies currently have access to. So, you've got to have good communication with the GP practices, or at least access to phlebotomy services. So there's a lot still to be worked out. But you're right, glass half full. These are all great steps in the right direction. Just want to keep people's expectations real about what difference it's going to make and the time scale.
And the infamous long-term workforce plan is still to come.
Do you mean the fabled?
The fabled workforce plan is still to come. Look, what we'll do is we'll pop up on the podcast social media the links to the delivery plan for recovering access to primary care, which people can read. And then we'll also pop up on there this report from the academy that you lead, which has come out today in conjunction with this.
Thank you for mentioning that, because yes, there's a whole heap of sort of over 50 vignettes of examples of brilliant work that's going on around the country, in fact around the UK, not just England, of great work that's happening across the primary secondary care interface to try and improve the flow of patients, smooth the way. At the end of the day, this is all about making patients' lives better and about making the system work more effectively.
Brilliant. As long as the famous 70s doorbell can be feature in any online access to GPs, then I'm happy. Right, let's take a break and then we'll introduce our guest. Welcome back. Prevention is the New Cure. This is our little podcast. I'm Steve Brine, and this is my partner, Dame Helen Stokes-Lampard. Hi, Helen.
Hi, Steve.
We have a guest on the pod today because we are talking diabetes. We're talking type 2 diabetes in particular, and we have a good friend of yours and mine, Chris Askew. Chris, who I met when he ran Breakthrough Breast Cancer, which merged with some other charities to become Breast Cancer Now. He now leads Diabetes UK. More than 5 million people in the UK are now living with diabetes, Helen. There's an alarming rise in people developing type 2 at a younger age. So that'd be under 40. So, even younger than me. So that's rising and that's worrying. So, we know type 2 has got a disproportionate impact on areas of high deprivation and in ethnic minority communities. And maybe we think we know a lot about diabetes. I'm sure you do, but our guest knows an awful lot more. Welcome to the Prevention is the New Cure podcast, Chris Askew.
Huge welcome, Chris. Glad to have you here.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Helen. Good to be here, and thank you very much for putting the focus onto diabetes.
Well, look, as you know, Chris, the select committee that I'm so fortunate to chair is doing this big inquiry into prevention, and you've given evidence to it recently and some of the work that we're doing. We are so focused on how the health service can be sustainable, how that can lead the health service to be better, but people to lead their best lives and their better lives. And, some conditions, God willing, then they're not always preventable. Type 2 diabetes, my understanding is that it is a preventable condition. And actually, it's one that you could turn around. Am I right?
You are right for many cases, Steve. And maybe this is a good time just to sort of lay down the definition. So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition in which your body's not producing insulin at all. Currently, it can't be prevented, although there are some very interesting immunotherapies coming along which offer the promise of potentially delaying its onset. And about 10% of all of the people, 8% of all of the people who've got diabetes have got type 1 diabetes. Type 2 is a condition in which you're either not making enough insulin or the insulin you are producing isn't being taken up by your body properly. It represents about 90% of the cases. And it's the fast rising numbers in type 2 that are really driving that figure of 5 million. That was a figure we released a couple of weeks ago, and it accounts for 4.3 million people that have had a diagnosis confirmed of any type of diabetes, but another 830,000 that we believe are living with diabetes, but currently they're not aware of it. And that's a real challenge because diabetes is an incredibly serious condition. And if it is not managed well through self-management and support, it can lead to really alarming complications. But to come back to your question, is it preventable? Not every case of type 2 diabetes is associated with living with overweight or obesity, but that is the single biggest risk factor for developing the condition. Then, as you say, there are other factors that can affect it, including, of course, where you live, ethnicity, family history. So, for example, people of African Caribbean, Black African, or South Asian descent are 2 to 4 times more likely to develop type 2 than a white person. And as
so
you
why
also
is that,
said,
Chris? Why is that, Chris?
Well, so there's genetic disposition at play here, and this is why in these discussions about what drives these numbers in type 2, if we end up on the horn of a very simple view, which is that this is just about living with overweight, or worse than that this is a simple case of the choices that people make, we hugely undervalue and underestimate the impact of this. There are complex genetics at play. Those genetics may come about as a result of ethnicity, but equally, our genetics affect the way in which we interact with our environment. Epigenetics play a large part. We don't all face the same choices in the same way. So we've really got to understand the complexity that drives this. It's only really by understanding that we can really begin to put together viable prevention strategies.
What do you reckon, Helen?
Look, Chris, as always, makes huge sense and explains very nicely the complexity here. So there's a really unhelpful social narrative about people bring diabetes on themselves. In the same way, there's an unhelpful narrative about many other health conditions. And we need to take away a lot of that stigma. Of course, where obesity is a major part in people's predisposition and their worsening of condition, absolutely, we need to throw everything at helping people. But actually, we need to be able to facilitate honest supportive, constructive conversations with people, and not create this into a you're fat, you got diabetes, sorted out, which is sometimes I do hear. And as a GP, that is so spectacularly unhelpful. Most of the people who are in my consulting room, people with newly diagnosed diabetes, are often very frightened. They've seen and heard a lot of things. Some of them are very embarrassed. I mean, come on, this is something we have to work with, as Chris is, and as you've outlined, Steve, the numbers are enormous. This is something we all know or are going to know people who have diabetes, and we all need to understand it better. In the years since I qualified as a GP, the treatments and the options and the understanding around diabetes have changed beyond recognition. When I trained first, we had insulin for the very severe patients, and we had metformin and glycoside if diet control had failed with your type 2 diabetes. Now we have a plethora of brilliant drugs. We have a great understanding of what needs to be done, and there's a huge amount of research going on, and I'm sure Chris can fill us in on more of that.
Chris, there's economics here, of course, isn't there, as well? Is that I'm always told, I've repeated this, so let's hope I'm right, that the NHS in England spends about £10 billion a year on type 2 diabetes. Is that a figure you recognise?
Yeah, it definitely is. And the bulk of that money is spent on those complications. So complications is a complicated word. But when we talk about complications, we mean other health conditions that can accrue as a result of your diabetes. So, and they're really sizable and they're really significant. So I'm going to give you some figures. These are complications arising as a result of diabetes, and these are per week, these figures. So in this country, we have 184 amputations a week, 770 strokes, 590 heart attacks, 2,300 cases of heart failure a week as a result of living with one type or another of diabetes, and that can accrue. That's not necessarily the case for everybody by any means, but that can accrue. So it's the human impact of that is immense. The economic impact of that falls with the NHS, and that 10% figure, you're absolutely right, and is largely spent on treating complications arising from one type or another of diabetes.
So just reverse back a bit there a minute, right? You said amputations from diabetes. Now, I've heard this before, obviously, when I was doing the public health job in government, and people might be surprised that can be an impact of diabetes. How does that end up happening?
Do you want me to take that one, Chris?
You take that one, absolutely, because you'll like that one way better than I can, Helen. Over to you.
So one of the complications of diabetes is that it affects the nerve endings. If you're not feeling, so we call peripheral neuropathy. So the fingers, your tips of your fingers and the tips of your toes, you start to lose sensation. And this is a gradual thing. People don't realize it's happening. And then you're at risk of damaging and injuring these places, particularly because, remember, fingernails are growing all the time. So there's always risk of infections getting in if this area is not looked after well. Once you've got infection in, it can get deep and people have no sensation that there is infection developing, which leads to destruction, which can lead to gangrene, which can lead to the need to have bits chopped off to save the rest of the limb. I'm trying to keep it straightforward. I did a vascular surgery host job when I was junior doctor, and we had one patient in who, when we walked on the ward, said to us as junior doctors, "Hi, I bet I'll be here when you leave in 6 months' time." And he was right, and he gradually was losing more and more of his legs. Now, I hoped and prayed that in the decades since then, we would be seeing far, far fewer amputations. I think the numbers are less than they used to be, Chris, but it's still shocking that so much of this is still happening when, as I said, we have so many treatments and things that are available and so much better education and understanding, but we still have such a long way to go.
Oh my goodness. I said that. Yeah, I mean, it is shocking, isn't it? Listen, I'm just going to press the doorbell. Listen, Chris. That can only mean one thing. That means that the pod surgery is open, and there's a couple of questions that have come in because we advertised. Obviously, we're going to talk to you, Chris. This is actually from somebody in Winchester. So this is from one of my fans, or not. Basically, the question is, they asked not to be named, which is fair enough. The question is around sugar tax and obesity, which is obviously policy that I, full disclosure, I implemented when I was in government. Isn't this all part of the nanny state, telling people what to do, telling people how to live their lives? Chris, you can take that one.
Yeah, gladly. And I remember that moment, and Steve, you and I were working on that, and I remember being stood on the green opposite Parliament alongside a spokesman from the soft drinks industry, and we both gave our side of the argument. And here we are, whatever it is, 8 years later, I think between 2015 and 2019, we decreased the amount of sugar in our soft drinks by about 35%, and yet the sales of soft drinks overall have gone up. So we took out about 90 tons of sugar, and yet the sales of sugars have gone up. The issue is we're drinking healthier drinks, much less sugar in them. And we did the same with salt. So these are really important policy changes that affect the environment in which all of us make choices. And it comes back to that point I said before, we don't all approach the same choice with equal weight. If I have financial means available to me, I get to choose a totally different set of foods than somebody that might not. If you are living in an area of high deprivation, you will invariably be drawn towards the cheaper foods. Of course you will. And yet it's those cheaper foods that are less healthy for you. So I would say this isn't a nanny state. I think this is, I don't think it's the entirety of our strategy around preventing cases of type 2 diabetes, but it is a really, really important element. And when we go out and poll people, I remember we polled people before the sugar drinks industry levy, and it was incredibly popular with the general public. The general public are up for support. People are up for help. We want help to make the right decisions. We absolutely want support, and that's a very important part of the landscape. So if you said to me, you might say to me, Steve, but if you said to me, okay, look back, look, the number of cases of type 2 diabetes has been rising pretty much since the 80s and 90s. What is the thing that is really driving it? One thing that it isn't is that we're not getting weaker in our willpower. So that is absolutely not the cause of it. The one thing that has changed and developed across that time is our access, much more regularly, much more frequently, outside of normal meal times, our access to cheap foods that are high in fat, salt, and sugar. I was at a meeting, interestingly, at the NHS about prevention the other day, and I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony of looking at the bottom of my free newspaper for that day, which had a free donut giveaway at the bottom of it, a free donut giveaway from 2 supermarkets that should know better. So I'm not saying that we should stop eating donuts. We absolutely shouldn't. These foods have got a role in our lives, and they're treat foods, but we should not be giving them away in a cost of living crisis free as a way of getting people into supermarkets. So there is a place for policy and legislation. It's not the entirety. We need lots of education. We need support. But we do have to take an interest in, foods that are being marketed to our children before 9 o'clock, etc. So there is a place, I think, for progressive reforms alongside lots of other interventions to help to really stem the flow of these new cases of type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
Yes. I've got one to bring in now, Chris. This one is a fairly assertive question from somebody, who, again, I won't mention their name, asking about access to bariatric surgery. I mean, Steve, you might have a comment on this as well. And certainly as a GP, I know I refer people for bariatric surgery often. Not many seem to come out the other end having had this surgery, but I seem to keep sending them off. The question really is, have we got postcode lottery for bariatric surgery? What can we do to fix it? And how can we fix it fast?
Yeah, really good question. And I mean, I think one thing that we've seen, I think you mentioned it, Helen, that we're still sadly in too much in this space, where in type 2 diabetes, or in terms of weight management, actually, there has been no choice, very little choice, very little on offer, very little support. The area has been wrapped up in stigma and stigmatizing attitudes and responses, and we've not had the sensible conversation, let alone delivered into healthcare, a full range of all the responses. Bariatric surgery absolutely has a part to play in that. In the right cases with the right support. Alongside that, we have got new drugs that have arrived now, Wegovy, Ozempic, and we've also got weight management services. The NHS first launched its NHS Diabetes Prevention Programme in 2016. Well over 1 million people have now been referred through that programme. And I think the figures are right here that between 2018 and 2019, that created a 7% reduction in the number of diagnoses of type 2 diabetes. We're also now trialling and expanding on the trial of remission. So my point is, I think we need a range of different treatments on offer. Those need to be available to different people at different points as we look at a wider weight management strategies. Bariatric surgery absolutely has. I'm not really into the intricacies of this, Helen. I know in other countries there's far more bariatric surgery that takes place. I also know it's not a silver bullet for absolutely everybody. I heard a very good expression the other day at a conference where we were talking about different strategies and actions for weight management, and it was that the patient never fails with a treatment around weight management. The treatment often fails. In other words, lots of treatments may not work for one person. One treatment might work. What's worked for one person? Diabetes prevention program, low calorie soups and shakes, might work for some people, but they may not work for the other. Equally with bariatric surgery. So I think the main point is we need a range of different treatments on offer here.
So you preempted just one more then, dear Steve and Helen. I read that the NHS are going to help with soup and shake diets for people with diabetes. Do the soup and shake and put the freshness back.
Yay!
This was an announcement last month, Chris, right? NHS England ministers were talking about this. Did I read this right? I presume that Diabetes UK have been involved in this one. What's this all about? Soups and shakes?
Yeah, that absolutely, Steve. And I do know about this one very much because Diabetes UK have been funding this for a number of years. We funded the original trial and we funded follow-up trials, and we've just funded the study that led to the 5-year data. So soups and shakes, let me sort of open this one out a bit, because it's I understand that the strap line, but it's heavily sort of misreported. So the trial that we funded, which had a control arm as well, but I should just say it's incredibly difficult to put together proper studies in weight loss which have got control arms, but this did have a control arm. So in other words, I had a group of people that weren't getting any treatment, I had a group of people that were getting the treatment, and the treatment was essentially very low calorie powder supplements which give you all the nutrients you need, but they take you down to about 600-700 calories a day. You're on that for about 10 to 12 weeks, and that leads to very rapid and very significant weight loss. After that, there's a return to eating, if I can call them, normal foods. So we call that the normalization stage. What we typically found was that people didn't go back to eating anything like the quantities they were ate before. Lots of stories of people looking at their dinner plates and saying, how on earth did I fill that up with food before? I need to eat off a side plate. But there is a normalization, because I think some people think this is a diet forever, and it isn't. So it's a time-limited period on the low calorie, then you normalize and go back to normal foods. And the study showed that after 5 years, a quarter of those people that were in remission of type 2 at 2 years were still in remission at 5 years. Of the whole lot, that was about 10% of the original people that started out 5 years before were actually in remission of type 2 diabetes. So what I mean by remission is they'd actually gone back across the diagnostic threshold and they were living in remission of type 2 diabetes. Always the chance that you could go back and get type 2, but in remission of it. So you might say 10%, that's not a great outcome. But we learned this is a trial. And we learned huge amounts about the trial. We learned, for example, what it would be to get someone back onto weight loss if they had regained some of that weight. And we learned a lot about normalization. But what I am really pleased to say is that there was enough evidence in that first trial for this to be introduced within the NHS. So September 2020, the NHS introduced what we now call the Path to Remission trial. 4,500 people took part in that. And the offer is that really after 12 months of that, we were looking at an maintained average weight loss of 11 kilograms. That is now being expanded. That was the news you were referring to, Steve. So this is, I think by March 2024, this is going to be available to everybody that qualifies. There are some qualification characteristics, which I won't go into, but they're to do with age, how long you've actually had your diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, your BMI, your HbA1c, which is your blood sugar levels. But I think what this showed was we can put type 2 diabetes into remission. This isn't the only way you can do it. When I arrived at the charity and looked on the website, we were talking about type 2 diabetes as a lifelong chronic condition from which there is no returning. And that is not the case now. The evidence is there to say you can put your type 2 in remission. So this is another one of those choices that we were just talking about that needs to be available to people. They should go talk to their GP about this and get referred on.
Interesting. I mean, look, we're all in the business of prevention, but I did mention at the top about turning type 2 around, and you remember Tom Watson, who was a Labour MP and colleague of mine in the House. You know, he I think it was quite a few years ago now, pre-pandemic actually, where he said how I lost 7 stone and reversed my type 2 diabetes. Do you experience that, Helen, in the surgery?
I have. It's been incredible. So I've seen people. So the reason the bariatric surgery question I flagged it was because I've actually seen that have a huge impact on people, helping them to get a start on their massive weight reduction, which has then led on to. But Tom was a very dramatic case, and he became evangelical about weight loss and how it can reverse your diabetes, but also the benefits of social prescribing, making people find all the good things that help them live a better life. And there's a whole heap of stuff here, going right back to what Chris said near the start about there are an awful lot of social factors in people's lives that all feed into this. And I think prevention in its widest sense prevents a whole range of diseases, one of which is diabetes. But if we can I mean, the fantastic research that has just been discussed is so powerful, but will have far wider consequences than just on diabetes, and that is a good thing.
Yeah, Chris, you're passionate about this. I can see that. You know, you said it's a great charity, and it must be great to make such a difference in people's lives and preventing ill health and all the things we've talked about that go along with that.
Yes, Stephen, I think, what we have with type 2, it is a bellwether of inequalities in society as well.
Yeah.
I mean, the inequalities in type 2 paid precisely over other inequalities. If you're in the most deprived neighborhoods and you're under 18 years old, you've got six times the greater chance of getting type 2 diabetes. So
Is that right?
if we can get prevention right in diabetes, then we can really think quite widely across lots of other metabolic conditions and long-term conditions and think about prevention. But we have to get in front of this because it's growing fastest now in the under 40s. So if you think about the value of investing in prevention for somebody that's under 40, that really changes the mathematics, and we just have to do a lot more to support people to live without type 2 at lower risk of it, or potentially to put their type 2 in remission. But it's a huge mission. Lots of exciting research going into it. The area is changing, and it needs to. And if I can just make this final point, we only get there when we get through the stigma. We have to get through that stigma. We've got to avoid the easy sidestep, and we've got to go through that stigma. And we've really got to start to understand why it is that as a society that we are living heavier with more weight, more of us living with obesity. If we stop at stigma, we make no progress.
Chris, it's been brilliant to talk to you. I think Chris he's a true believer, Helen, in the prevention and agenda. Those. He's going to end up with fellowship of the pod if he carries on like this.
Now there's a concept.
There's an idea.
You've just invented it, haven't you?
Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
People can find out more, obviously, Diabetes UK online and all of your social media channels, and
including if you're worried about your risk of type 2, take the Know Your Risk score, which you'll find on our website. Absolutely, Steve.
Great plug.
Great, brilliant. Thanks so much. So look, we trailed last time that we were going to talk diabetes at some point in the future. Coming up on the podcast, so we're going to be talking about body image and the Recognise Body Image campaign that's been put together by Dr. Luke Evans, who's an MP colleague of mine, used to be on the Health Select Committee. Brilliant campaign talking about how body image can really impact the health of young people, young women, but also young men. We're talking to him at some point. We're going to be talking HIV and AIDS, actually, with a friend of mine. I chair the all-party group here in Parliament on that and how we prevent that. And then I think, Helen, we're going to return to cancer, aren't we? We're going to talk to some of our friends in the cancer community, following up on the special we did with Callie Palmer about cancer and how we prevent that.
Yeah, absolutely. So many topics for us to pick up on, Steve. But also we're always open to ideas and suggestions. If you've got something great you want us to talk about, we are very careful that we try not to promote individual companies. We try to be careful in the way we balance things, but we really want to get under the skin of both the politics and the health issues. So keep the ideas coming.
So look, podcast at stevebryan.com. Find us on social media. Suggest your ideas for our discussions. Suggest your ideas for the pod surgery. And please make sure you follow the podcast on whichever platform you listen to it on, which would be much, much appreciated. We're incredibly grateful for your help and your support. Until next time, Helen.
Been great seeing you. Chris, thank you hugely once again for your time. Chris. It's been great conversation. Bye.
See you soon. Till next time. Bye.